Hi everyone, and welcome to Matriarch Illuminations, the second event in a 5-part series hosted by Jessica Wood. My name is Nadine Van Dalen, and I'm a Master of Public Policy and Global Affairs student at UBC's School of Public Policy and Global Affairs, and I am looking forward to learning with you tonight. I acknowledge the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people whose traditional unceded territory I join this evening's virtual gathering from as an uninvited guest in today's Ottawa, Ontario. I reflect in this moment on the countless debts we owe as settlers to the Indigenous peoples who have long cared for the lands and waters we know and love today in the various places we call home. I also acknowledge the Musqueam people who host the University of British Columbia Vancouver campus that has brought us together this evening for this important conversation. Because we're on a virtual platform, I invite you to reflect upon the Indigenous lands that you are on today as well. I'd like to explicitly state for my fellow settlers in advance that let this evening's gathering serve as a reminder, but more importantly, a catalyst for the work to be done to dismantle systems of oppression, to bring to light systematically hidden truths, and to challenge destructive colonial ideologies that run rampant in our culture and institutions today. It is our responsibility to do so. Before continuing, I would like to mention 2 housekeeping notes. 1, that this webinar is being recorded, and 2, that later on we'll be taking audience questions, so you're welcome to add your questions to the Q&A box that you'll see at the bottom of your screen. I now wish to introduce you to the creator of this dynamic series, Jessica Wood. Jessica Wood is known as Si Sityaawks, Woman Who Creates Change, and she is the current Policy Practitioner Fellow at the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs. Jessica is from the Gitxsan and Tsimshian nations with extended roots with the Tahltan and Nisga'a Nations. She's currently serving, although not tonight to be clear, as the Assistant Deputy Minister for the Reconciliation, Transformation and Strategies Division within the Ministry of Indigenous Relations and Reconciliation for the province of BC. Jessica is leading BC's cross-ministry work to adopt and implement the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada's calls to action, and relevant learnings from relevant case laws in the Tahltan decision. Tonight's theme is safety and matriarchy, and it's my pleasure to also introduce you to our special guest, Brenda Butterworth-Carr, who is known as njit, shär, and dintlät, who is the Assistant Deputy Minister and Director of Police Services and has been leading the policing and security branch in the Ministry of Public Safety and Solicitor General in British Columbia since March of 2019. In the past year, as the Director of Police Services, Brenda has provided central oversight of policing, law enforcement, and the security industry in BC. Working collaboratively with branch executives, Brenda and her team develop and administer public safety initiatives dedicated to the protection of British Columbians. Brenda began her career with the RCMP in 1987 as a Native Special Constable and continued her 23 years of service in various roles with the RCMP in BC and Yukon Territory. Prior to joining the ministry, she was the commanding officer of the British Columbia RCMP, the largest RCMP division in Canada. As a First Nations woman from the Gitxsan Nation, Yukon Territory, Brenda has had many firsts, and her diverse career has provided her with extensive experience and solid understanding of policing service agreements, operations, management of critical incidents and crisis negotiation, crime prevention, community and Indigenous policing, and executive leadership. It is now my honor to turn it over to Jessica Wood and to have the opportunity to listen and learn with you this evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Nadine. And thank you, Brenda, for joining me tonight. I want to take a moment to acknowledge that I'm on the territory of the Sityaawks First Nations and Salt Spring Island. We are part of the Wasanic, Chemainus, and Cowichan First Nations. And a special thank you to the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs at UBC, to Tamara Baldwin, to Tina, to Nadine, to Allison, and to the Women in Policy for making tonight possible and the series possible. And to reiterate something that Nadine so kindly mentioned, both Brenda and I are here tonight as Indigenous women who have some subject matter expertise to engage in a discussion on matriarchy and safety, but we are not here tonight representing the province of BC. And that's a really important distinction. We all have many roles to play, and as Sigurd, so as honorable women from our own communities, that's the roles in which we're speaking here today. I have had the pleasure of knowing Brenda for only a short time personally, but by reputation for quite some time. And when it comes to policing and community safety and addressing issues of violence, but also of opportunity for shared understanding and progress, Brenda's name comes first. So I feel very honored to welcome you all to this conversation that I feel very privileged to be able to have tonight. So Brenda, I'd like to welcome you to the conversation with Matriarch Illuminations and start us off with a question about what matriarchy and safety, what those two things together mean to you.
Yeah, well, first of all, I just, again, wanted to acknowledge the territory which I'm participating from, the Lekwungen-speaking people of the Songhees and Esquimalt. And again, my true honor and privilege to be joining you as well, and very much looking forward to the conversation and staying within the time that we actually have allocated. Well, that might be a bit challenging, but yeah, so,
well,
you know, when I
think everybody into Indigenous time tonight.
Yeah.
We might be here a while. Okay, sorry, please go.
No, thank you for that. And when I think about safety and matriarchy, what I think about is, really the traditional teachings that were instilled in me from the time that I was born into my nation. And the importance of always representing your nation in a good way, and the words, thoughts, and deeds that you speak and do, that they have to be very reflective of your traditional teachings. And when I grew up into my community, there was a lot of things that were occurring, and very much in relation to the Klondike Gold Rush, right? So there was displacement of my family members, and as well as the introduction of the Indian Act and so forth. And the elders, as they continue to set about the phenomenal work that they've done within the territory. And what I mean by that is the self-government agreements, in addition to our land claim entitlements. And they were fairly courageous when they went across Canada to Ottawa, and they met with the former Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau, and set about, ensuring that those entitlements and rights are enshrined within our self-government agreements and land claim entitlements. But the other piece, which I think is really important to remark upon, is that as I was, I mentioned growing up in my home community, it was always expected of the citizens that we would do what we could to work in a space, and whether that was within government or non-government, that we would work as long and as hard as we could to influence and affect positive change. And the things that I was observing in my community, based upon, like I said, the displacement, residential school, and, the many things that we come to know as a huge part of our history, and frankly, the foundations of our fabric of society, that I really genuinely felt that I had something to contribute. And I think the other important piece to note is that the birth order that I was born into my family. So it's always been expected that, being the oldest of the cousins, the oldest daughter, that, I have a great role and responsibility with respect to contributing, again, in a good way family-wise, but also ensuring that, my family members are supported, and that we work together in that interconnectedness. And I say fabric because I think there's a real sense of that, right? Like, there's so many pieces that are utilized to create that it's really about all of us working in harmony and having that real synergistic interactions with each other. And it doesn't matter if we're harvesting, it doesn't matter if we're creating, you know, safe space to have discussions in a good, honest way, or, you know, if we're participating in our traditional ceremonies, it's done, you know, in the hierarchy of family, but it's done in a manner where, you know, it's safe and people feel that they have the ability to contribute in a good way. And so I think it's really important for me to state that at the onset, because that is who I am. It's a critical part of how I see the world and the manner in which I continue to contribute to public safety. And so, you know, as I continue to, you know, continue through my teenage years and then made that decision, pardon me, as to what I would do in terms of future state, I had many interactions with the RCMP, because that was the police of jurisdiction and continues to be in my community, and interactions and so forth that I felt that that would be a profession or a vocation in terms of public safety to work within community. And so I engaged, you know, within my former career at the age of 19. And it was, right. So, you know, and it's funny because even prior to going to what's known as Depot in the academy in Regina, I had already worked with them in a summer student capacity from the time that I was 18. So I was very much involved in that process for quite some time. And I think the other thing that's pretty important for me to note on a personal level is that when I did make that decision to go to Depot and was, you know, recruited and my application was successful, I was also a mom. I had my first son when I was 16 years old. So, you know, that was another driving factor for me over and above my family role and responsibility. But I needed to provide security for my oldest son at the time. And, you know, so when I went to training, I managed to go back to my home territory. And I think, you know, in my mind, that was an incredible opportunity, because then I felt like I could contribute. I can contribute in a meaningful way to my home territory. And it didn't matter which community I was actually working in. It was the fact that I was able to, again, in many ways, be a bit of a liaison between those that had no firsthand interaction with our Indigenous communities, as well as participate in many of the initiatives that were being introduced. So, you know, the alternative forms of justice, restorative justice, you know, all types of justice, which is very similar to some of my traditional teachings, right? And again, appreciating that it has to be very reflective of the community. So, and, you know, as I continued through the course of my former career, and, you know, I as mentioned, 32 years, I had an intersecting point, and I shared this story with you previously, and I was out with my family members and we were harvesting, and this big, beautiful black wolf materialized, and, you know, being able to see so like a lone wolf on its own out in the natural environment was an indicator to me that I had some choices to make on a personal level, whether I stayed with my former profession or if another opportunity was going to avail itself. And, you know, when I came back down to the Lower Mainland where I was living, I was offered the opportunity to come to my current position. And so it was a reinforcement that, you know, our elders and my elders were guiding me to where I needed to be through the spiritual world. And frankly, you know, being able to see this wolf in that manner. And so, you know, fast forward a little bit today, and the privilege that we have in leading, you know, the discussion and frankly, the initiative of public safety and policing and the evolution in a time where it's always mattered. Obviously, the evolution matters, but in a time where there's such a provocative and topical discussion, I think is incredible. And you know, I also believe that how the lens that I see it and the reality and the experiences that I have, as well as the team that I have the privilege to work with, has certainly led me to be where I need to be today, and contributing in that meaningful way, and really factoring in, you know, those elements which I'm highlighting through the you know, initial stages of responding to your question.
There's so many more questions. I ask you one and I end up with 26 more. There's a couple of things in what you share, just to open up, that really resonate with me. One is the strength that comes from knowing who you are and where you come from, and how so many ways that's interrupted for our people, or has been for so long, and what a difference that makes in the ability to connect to your community, find meaning, find purpose, find employment, and be able to trust your instinct to follow those guides when big timber wolf stands in front of you and reminds you you have choice and that you have a calling. I think I'm just going to take a moment too to acknowledge that for somebody like myself who has had struggled interactions with different arms of enforcement, to work with an Indigenous woman who's the head of police services for the province, when the dialogue around women and safety and Indigenous women and safety is more pivoted around what will happen when we lose our lives or disappear or go missing, than it is that we can lead our province towards safety. And I just want to acknowledge that, because that has been something that you have contributed to since you were 19 years old. And that in itself, as a policy leader, as a public servant, as a matriarch, to invest in safety for your community, for your family, and for all of us as a whole, is something that I believe deserves to be honored and acknowledged, because it is not common. And it should be, because all of those teachings that you're talking through, what you said about the time for evolution, I lean more towards revolution, definitely. And rematriation. For me, decolonization is rematriation of how we reclaim those positions of leadership that we've already experienced, that we've already had built, where we have experiences of gender equity that we're trying to reclaim, not experience for the first time. And so that part about evolution to me really resonates with me. And identifies for me a gap, I guess, is probably where my next question for you will come, is where do you see the gap and therefore the opportunity when it comes to public safety for this dialogue? I mean, we have maybe, 80 policy, either leaders or instructors or students who are joining us today, about where do you see policy or practice around public safety, around community safety going?
Yeah, and that's a great question. I think, some of the things that we've been contemplating, and of course through, a fairly broad consultation, we still have far more extensive consultation to happen, future state in relation to the professional career. But where I think, the gap continues to remain is the comfort of discussion. And what I mean by that is to really embrace and engage and acknowledge that, systemic racism exists. Because it does. And, it is institutionalized. And, I know that's a very hard conversation for many people, but I think that, if you're going to create the change that we all want to have happen, as well as just simply acknowledge that, there is a huge amount of history, there's still a huge amount of discussion and things that are occurring in this current space, that we have to acknowledge that, and we have to continue acknowledging it, and we have to have courage to be able to have those conversations, and frankly, look to the areas where we need to continue creating change. And I think from a policing environment, by way of example, as I mentioned, the first piece is acknowledging it exists. And it doesn't necessarily equate to that you've got an organization full of racist individuals. It's the fact that the policies and processes and practices aren't reflective of the diversity of individuals that you have the responsibility to provide that public safety for. And I don't think you can shy away from that. I also believe that there's a tremendous balance that needs to occur as well. I think that, you know, when we're shaping policies, that it's very important to find that critical path where you're reflecting the changes that need to happen, but you're also doing it in an evidence-based manner, and that you're also in harmony with those that actually have to provide and will continue to provide services. And, you know, one thing that you had mentioned to me about, or asked me about community safety. So for me, you know, euphoria would be if the calls for service weren't coming in. You know, if the calls for police, as an example, right? Because I see public safety as a broad spectrum. It's a continuum of services. It's, you know, those that are charged with support for health and addictions and wellness and all those components, including, you know, the proactive interactions that should be occurring for those police of jurisdictions, and, you know, all the way to where they have to, then, you know, there's enforcement, and then, you know, entering into the judicial system. Like, I just see this as a whole continuum of services. And, you know, the work that we're engaged in, I recall in my former capacity, by way of example, like, wouldn't it be, you know, great if we could prevent the homicides from happening? Wouldn't it be great if we prevented the calls weren't coming in, because we were working in harmony, that, you know, whatever policies that we were drafting and creating, that they would be reflective of that. And so I think, by way of example, we have an opportunity here within the province with the special committee that was in place and that will soon be reconstituted. And when we drafted the terms of reference, what we were clear about is ensuring that we recognized DRIPA. We recognized that the Mental Health Act needed legislative changes. We recognized that the Police Act is incredibly cumbersome, and despite there being, you know, many opportunities for evolution of that, right? So whether it's oversight, whether it's, you know, the reflection of the Braidwood inquiry, the reflection of Wally Opal's Forsaken, and those things have, you know, certainly provided updates to the Police Act, but it's still cumbersome. And so, you know, one area where I feel that we really need to shift the focus to, in addition to the policy examples that I've been given, is that if we have, you know, an act which changes the language, currently within the Police Act, it references police and law enforcement. That's always been a little bit of a bugaboo for me. It's always been a little bit of a stickler for me, because it should be about public safety. It should be about prevention. It should be about you know, community safety, where communities, again, have that ability to occupy their space. Like, they ultimately have the responsibility, or should be afforded that responsibility, with support from government, whether at the provincial or federal level, where they have the ability to take ownership of whatever initiative is going to work best for them. And I reflect on the discussion that we engaged in for the last couple of days at the Justice Summit. And there was a consistency of, you know, to do away with short-term sentencing. Because what are the benefits? What are you genuinely trying to achieve when you're incarcerating individuals for 30, 60, 90, or 120 days? Like, they don't have the same access to programming and support that others do. And, you know, then again begs the question, why are they being incarcerated in the first place? And what are the off-ramps where people are being successfully supported in community, and that, you know, you're looking for those early interventions? You know, I know that we've got examples through situation tables where there are multidisciplinary approaches. And I think the critical piece there is providing space for community to take ownership, you know, where they have that ability to do so. I know that, you know, I've had colleagues look at me and say, well, if you're in Si Sityaawks, by way of example, you know, you don't have the same access to support services that you would in more of a metropolitan area like Surrey or Vancouver. And I said, for me, then the goal should be, how do you gain them in those areas? How do you make it more accessible for individuals and communities so that they've got those supports?
So if I paraphrase that last bit that you just said, before I go back to the last bit you just said, you're saying that incarceration, because there are no services, isn't the solution.
Agreed.
You know, like
like
that, it can't, you can't, it doesn't equate the outcome that it's intended to by having a short-term sentence in the same way. And that is a policy or a legal approach that is contrary to 20 years of like broken window approaches. If you have a, you know, full force of the law at all times, you know, we always bring the heavy. And for Indigenous communities, I have to say, like, up north, like, you pay attention when there's an officer in your community, because that means something is up and somebody is either at risk or has already been harmed. And will it escalate? Will there be more? And it's a really different approach to consider how you tackle these things from a position of social justice and equity and harm reduction, and from like how you practice law enforcement from a trauma-informed practice. Like that's what you're discussing, is how we operate as a community from a trauma-informed perspective. I mean, I love what you call it, euphoria. You call it the euphoria. And I'm after that. Like I'm not interested in raising graduation rates a bit. I want Indigenous excellence. I want to see Indigenous students lead graduation rates. I'm not interested in a lesser goal than the full euphoria of our dreams. And so I love that concept about bringing euphoria into the future state, that there are no calls for that type of enforcement. There are calls for early intervention and support. And that's really what we're getting at with that matriation and safety discussion.
Yes.
Is that our aunties are always on call. Our grandmothers are always on call, and they are ready to dole out justice. Like, I would rather be in jail than face my grandmother's left eyebrow being raised. Like, that is just something that I can't even contemplate. My cousin and I call it JA justice. JA is our word for grandmother. And that is so true for so many of our communities. But to think of euphoria of aligning that with actual services is fascinating to me. That we could reestablish those communities of care, because that left eyebrow being raised isn't to shame. It's to pay attention, and to even pay more attention, and how we support policy and lawmaking. For those that we're following along, I believe the special committee you're talking about is specific to BC's Police Act, and that there's been a commitment to revamp that. And it's very exciting to me that somebody who has this lived experience and this value and this professional experience gets to guide that exploration towards euphoria about what the best practice of that could be. Piece I do think we do need to I'm interested in also touching base on is that thought you had about systemic racism, because so many of us make it personal. So many within the system as public servants, as in institutions, make it personal. That if you call out institutional or systemic racism, you're saying you who work for the institution are racist. We're saying, no, you probably have some sort of privilege that you're benefiting from, but that you have influence over a system that even if there were no racists in it, will continue to oppress, because that's how it was built. And our jobs as the cogs in that system is actually to stop that, to acknowledge it and stop that. And I want to unpack that a bit, because it's so scary. It's so scary. And we talk about it all the time. We're like, well, it's systemic racism. And we're like, you know, that's what it is. And then people are like, oh my God, did they just say racism? You know, it's hard to say, you know, let alone anti-Indigenous racism or like I think there's something there. I think there's something about just acknowledging and normalizing the self-critique of the institutions we're a part of. And that be okay, that actually be good and best practice. What do you think about that? I know I'm like, I think I know what you think, but I'd actually like to hear us unpack it a bit.
Yeah, no, I agree wholeheartedly. And I think about the conversation that you and I have had in relation to the work that you've undertaken with DRIPA and the 10 principles, and, you know, ensuring people are really consulting in the manner in which it's intended, and they're really reflecting that, you know, our communities across this province should see themselves in policies. They should be able to feel comfortable with it. It's not dissimilar to the discussion that I've had in relation to police stops, right? That is incredibly topical right now. It's very polarizing, particularly the street check component that's contained within the police stops, right? So, you know, as we have set up this.
I believe you. I have a physical reaction to just the, you know, just the thought, how, let alone the experience, let alone the witnessing. So it does, like, we have a visceral reaction to it, but what do you do with that that's constructive?
Well, and that's the portion that I was mentioning in terms of finding the balance, right? Again, appreciating that it's very polarizing for, you know, our most vulnerable who are on the streets, by way of example, or are being interacted with the local police of jurisdiction. And again, appreciating that we have so many advocacy agencies that are supporting our most vulnerable and being supportive to them, so that they clearly understand that, you know, if they are approached, that the police officer has justifiable reasons, and they can articulate them, and it's recorded. And yes, many, you know, certainly have indicated that they're doing wellness checks and so forth. But again, it's really ensuring, you know, the general public clearly knows what's expected. And if there isn't an actual reason that the police officer hasn't in fact identified, then, you know, they're not compelled to provide them information. But it's the education that's associated to it. And on the other hand, you know, with respect to the common law and what needs to be available for police officers to continue to do their jobs in a way that, you know, they are trained to do it, so that, you know, we don't have extreme examples of, you know, individuals being harmed or go missing, and then there's no record of, you know, where they're at, or any of those pieces of critical information that investigations would require, right? It's the balance within that. And again, you know, when you're setting standards, it begs the question, okay, why are they needed? Like, what has happened that you have to create standards in the first place? And again, the whole assessment associated to that. So, you know, you hear anecdotal type of stories, and yet it's really important to have, you know, that empirical evidence, as we talked about, so that, you know, you can quantify it. And yet at the same time, be mindful that you're not going to be able to necessarily capture all incidents. And so you still have to find that space where you're creating standards and then guidelines and policies that are reflective of it. So, you know, it's a little bit technical, but, you know, back to your question is, it's always that tricky space of trying to satisfy what you're implementing in the first instance. And with this whole discussion around police stops, and then, you know, again, the street checks, as they are a part of that, it's reinforcing for police officers their actual authorities. And again, as I mentioned, you know, the rule of law is critical, and that they're interacting with individuals in the way that is laid out within not only the Constitution, but frankly, what's expected of police officers. And giving them the space where they can have those interactions, but in the manner it's intended. And as well, provide clarity for people across this province that, as I mentioned earlier, that if there's a reason they're being stopped, they have to be told what that reason is. If they're being requested, you know, identification, there needs to be reasons for that. So it is quite a balance, and not an easy one. And so, you know, when I think about your question related to the, you know, the visceral reaction that you had to that, that's that balance. And the only way that we can manage it effectively is through extensive consultation.
Yeah, it's, you know, I mean, I've been told by a court prosecutor that racial profiling works. And my question to them was, for whom? Because this also has to assume or ensure that there is no systemic racism, bias or dysfunction within the system for that to be considered fair, just, etc. And the other part, you know, my reaction probably remains the same. It's challenging because I know that for myself, navigating those interactions, I do not assume that even if I know my rights or assert them, that they will be respected, because there are so many ways in which I navigate through a day in which that is not so. Yeah. Starting with my wallet and the Indian Act card that's in it. Like, there are so many ways in which that's not actually my lived experience, that how it should be and how it is are so fundamentally different. And I think that's the gap for me in terms of the evolution. Mm-hmm. and how we evolve past, like you said, past where we are to that euphoric place that there is no need for a call, that there is no need for the street check, that the role of safety in our communities is in the hands of our communities, and that it can constructively and holistically be a part of our fabric, that we are protected and safe. And right now, with the acknowledgement of systemic racism, et cetera, that it becomes so impossible almost to even envision what that euphoric place could be with the pieces that we have in the state in which they are. And so that's where I, like, how do you get to dream, right? Like, how do you get to even fantasize the sort of I don't have the words. This is where I'm not a great academic. You know, I want to say like post-industrial, you know, community safety state. Like, what is beyond enforcement when we think about community safety? What are those tools? Like, how do we've had different CARs that have focused on mental health and safety. We've had community policing. We've had policing in schools. We've had alternate courts. We have different experiments, and I love the idea of figuring out what the goal is and working towards that, and that be constant. What's the full euphoric for you besides the calls?
Yeah, so there's a couple
coming
things.
In.
Yeah, no, there's a couple things that really resonate for me. It's the whole policing piece. Like, if you think back to like the traditional teachings of peacekeepers or peaceful intervention or peaceful settings, and you know, the respect in terms of the hierarchy within families, and you know, those that had the responsibility. And so I somewhat inferred it when I was mentioning the Police Act and the terminology when it says police and law enforcement. That is about the tail end. It's really about creating language and reinforcing, well, not creating language, but making sure the language is reflected in whatever legislation that we're implementing, but shift that. And that's what I was saying earlier, is it's always been a bit of a bone of contention for me, although I referenced it as a bugaboo. But when we continue to say law enforcement, really, you know, that's part of the shift. It's part of the language. It's part of the change that needs to happen. And in terms of, you know, in responding to your question around what I think euphoria is, I think, you know, even the conversations that we had over Friday and Saturday with the group of individuals that were participating in the Justice Summit, it's understanding that the synergy that needs to be created, that the interconnectedness of government and non-government and communities, and furthering those. And again, you know, giving space and reinforcing that space to communities, because most of them know what they have the ability to achieve. And, you know, if there's certain services that need to be provided, then focus on, you know, creating those pathways for services and accessibility. And so euphoria, as I mentioned, it's really about where communities have ownership and they're fully supported to be successful. And it doesn't matter if they're remote or isolated, that, you know, they just genuinely have the fundamentals of what they need. And, you know, I also have worked long and hard in my former career, with communities, because there are many, many locations where, as I mentioned, they don't have the same services, and often, police agencies are the ones that are there. Like, they're the ones filling the space. And for me, it's
the ones that can get there.
True, right? And yeah, and for sure. And so, that's part of the reshaping, if you will, of public safety. And that's where I'm very emphatic of, restating public safety, right? Policing is just an element of it. It's all those services that I was talking about previously. And
it's so interesting, because what you're describing is like policing, like law enforcement has become what peacekeeping is, instead of that full suite of interactions around public safety. And that, for me, around like how you engage with vulnerability in a way that is healthy and supportive rather than punitive, is part of those teachings, right? It's that shift from peacekeeping to law enforcement. And I have to say, I haven't actually articulated that in my own thinking about this. I had to go through this when looking at law, because I saw law as, ultimately punitive and oppressive. You start with the Indian Act and you just keep going. And there are some elements that are exceptional, or Charter of Rights and Freedoms, etc., but they never seem to be inclusive or reflective. What I found through the drafting of the Declaration Act and wrestling with that is that law can actually be art. If you have a mastery, you can actually start to recognize our shared humanity with that. And that's another element that I'm seeing here when you start thinking about peacekeeping versus law enforcement, and how we might, for lack of better words, decriminalize vulnerability, that we start to actually explore and support vulnerability in peacekeeping rather than enforcement, which becomes really, really strict, really fast.
It absolutely can be. And I say continuum of services because I think it needs to be very reflective of the communities and the individuals and so forth. But, a small, more of a granular example. So, you have an individual in a community that maybe there's employment issues or something related to that, right? And so they go out, they commit, a minor crime frankly, just to be able to support themselves. There's an interaction, they end up getting charged, they're released on conditions. And then, maybe there's a wellness issue factored into it, but it hasn't been contemplated or considered in the release conditions. Well, then, there's going to be breach charges. And then you've got this cyclical type of process. And so, for me, I think that, across government, and certainly the role that I have and the pleasure that I have with many of my ADM colleagues that I work with is shifting again that conversation. And I know it's a bit provocative because you have to create that space where, there's always going to be the separation with respect to prosecution and so forth. But with the people that are the ones making the decisions, in that time, if there was a place where they could defer to, or if there was an intersecting point where you're really addressing the root issue versus sort of the symptom. And, that's another portion of where I'm very passionate about those conversations. And again, working with communities where they can construct something if it doesn't already exist, right? That they have, and I'm just mindful, like because when I think of the mainstream justice system, and I'm not meaning to be disparaging in my comments, it's clear it doesn't work, and it certainly doesn't work well for any of our Indigenous people from across this country. It doesn't. There's enough quantitative evidence to support that. So, it's again, actively engaged in opportunities where, we have services available at the forefront. And I know, like I said, there's tremendous amount of examples and initiatives where we have those in place, but it's not consistent and it's not fulsome. And so, you know, I also hearken back to one of the items that you raised with respect to like the CAR programs, right? The CAR 67 or 54, and that's with police of jurisdictions, and they have psychiatric nurses that they have on shifts. And so they respond to calls, and, you know, where there is a individual in crises, then they've got somebody that has that specialty care. And again, it is proactive, but it's also in a policing realm, right? And I think euphoria, I know euphoria for me would be if it didn't come into that realm in the first place, because the person has the wraparound care that they needed, and it wouldn't have escalated into a call for crises. And again, I think that, you know, the standards that we have in this province and the incredible amount of training that our police undertake on a regular basis, I think that, you know, that is very much a necessity. I also think that if you've got the practitioners in place to deal with it, then they wouldn't escalate to the point where then you've got that response happening.
That piece about you know, the individual who made a choice, probably the best of the lesser of evils. And that really resonates with me, of how we decriminalize poverty. How we actually get at the root cause is criminalizing somebody for a stopgap measure to keep their family afloat. Get us the outcome that we're looking for, which is non-reoffending, that we're looking for holistic, healthy communities. And we like to tell kids it's okay to make mistakes, but not too much and not too often. And you have to learn from them, but then the system also needs to learn from its own mistakes and its own wisdom and its own experience and its own data, and evolve and seek that euphoric state. I'm very aware of the time. I think something or something there. I could see flashes, and I felt like there was a timer going down. Hi, Nadine. Hi, welcome. Are we there already? How is this happening? So shall we flip to some questions? Have some come in?
Good time to take questions.
Yeah, I think we do.
Yes, we do have some. So the first question: what impact do you think that internal self-regulation has on the inability to acknowledge and manage systemic racism and the lack of cultural humility within police institutions?
That's a great question. I think that, frankly, if you're not willing to acknowledge it, it's pretty challenging to actually address it. And so, you know, from my perspective, what I'm saying, the acknowledgement that it exists, and then also understanding what systemic racism frankly means, that, you know, there's a reason where there would be an increase of oversight, an increase of governance, an increase of all of those components where you're dealing with it in that reactive approach versus being proactive and being forward-leaning, and just acknowledging that, you know, I really like the way Jessica framed it, is you can change every individual in the organization, but if you haven't actually addressed the foundational components, and as I mentioned, the policies and practices, it's going to be very challenging to evolve and frankly address the systemic racism. It's like, I don't see how that could possibly happen. Maybe it's in the recruiting, maybe it's you know, referenced in how you attend a sudden death, by way of example. Yes, you'll have the policies and practices in place, but is it really reflective of the community that you're attending to? Is it really reflective and acknowledging, you know, the cultural practices of the individual that you have to attend to, and the family, and how families need to be a part of this depending upon which community and culture you're from? So
I think that's a really provocative question that can apply to so many topics too, around public trust, around trust in the system. And I think we talked about this, about systems and institutions are resilient against change, and that means that they last a very long time, but it also means that they perpetuate the parts of their system that are unjust for so long. And so I think there's there's something to be said about that trust. Do we trust the system? Do we trust the institution? Are we examining and refining and fixing its shortcomings? We will be joined soon by Mary Ellen Trapelafond, who is also doing a review of racism in our healthcare system in the province, and she'll be one of our guests in the future. In that case, I can't say that I don't believe in public health care. I fundamentally do. I also believe in a non-racist public health care, and that those needs to be foundational things that happen at the same time. And that if there is a mistrust, that mistrust is, daylighted and expunged, and that we put in fail-safes to make resilient against it coming back in. And I think that's the benefit of a system, of a society, is that we can be resilient against letting that type of supremacy and oppression and other things back in. And I think that's something really important to think about. So that's part of my answer to that question, is public trust.
Yeah, and I honestly think that's a great thing. And I frankly, that's why I'm more optimistic, and not that was ever less optimistic, I guess I should qualify that a little bit, but why I'm more optimistic and frankly passionate about this, because we're in an incredible space. Notwithstanding the fact that there's been some incredibly violent outbreaks within the States, in a Canadian context, I think that the discussion is alive, the recognition is alive, and that, when we're talking about the trust and the will and the ability, I think that, certainly from the individuals that I've talked to, external, internal to government, and, at very high levels, it is fully recognized, right? And I think that part of that discussion and part of that movement, if you will, is so incredibly beneficial to the changes that need to happen. And it's not about politics necessarily overshadowing the rule of law, but it's the balance. And again, recognition of public trust, because even within this current environment, statistically, there's still a fairly high level of trust for police agencies. And, depending upon where you're coming from, again, empirical evidence. Where I see that there's increased value and opportunities for trust is to deal with the issues themselves, right? Acknowledge them, identify them, address them, and that it reinforces the need to change and why it needs to happen. And I also think that, there's incredible opportunity for a little bit of peer pressure as well, right? Not only public expectation, because that exists and it should exist. The expectation from public as a whole is that this conversation needs to continue to be front and center, as well as, the recognition that change needs to happen. And what I would say as well is there's still the balance, because you have police officers across this country that come to work every day, and their whole goal is to contribute to public safety. Their whole goal is to contribute to community safety in a good, positive way. And, to be able to reinforce their ability to do that. So when those calls come in for service, regardless of what they may be, and in particularly when individuals are in crises, that they're able to do that in a good, safe way. And, that is that balance.
Peer accountability and peer communities of practice are so important. Now, Nadine, I think we have another question from Catherine Blackstock. Oh. I saw on there. We're going to try to squish it in.
For sure. Yes, it reads, I love the idea of eliminating the short-term sentences, but it has to be replaced by something else. I think of the poverty, drug and alcohol addiction, and lack of housing. How to break the cycle. Small towns can be brutal on some of the persons doing the crime. How to bring everyone in.
Yeah, and that's another great question, and that's what I was alluding to during my at one point during my conversation with Jessica's. It can't just be completely eliminated without another option, and in terms of dealing with the root issues within communities and ensuring that they have the necessary supports to be successful. So I hearken back to a conversation that I had recently with respect to simple possession, so possession of narcotics. And for the most part, within a BC context, you don't have law enforcement officers focusing on individuals that have small amounts of personal use. And, you know, that has continued to be reinforced. At the same time, you know, we have many individuals in this current environment, because of the toxicity of drugs, that are still succumbing to overdose. And, you know, again, creating that pathway so they have the necessary supports to be successful. And, you know, I'm certainly not naive to think that this is going to happen overnight. And I'm very aware of the effort and energy that has happened to date. I still think, though, that if there's a concerted effort and you've got everyone working in tandem, that there's definitely more of an opportunity to ensure that those support mechanisms exist.
Thank you. The piece of Catherine's question there that I would touch on is how different life is in rural areas. Like, how do you have a restraining order against an abuser in a community of 150 where they're 2 doors down? And you can bring in enforcement by boat. It will take you 6 hours to get somebody there. But like the ways in which we think in the South and in cities about how the world works and how equitable or equitably justice can either be doled out, experienced, or sought. In any one of these situations is so different in a small community. It just so is. I mean, it has lasting impacts through generations, to be honest, because there's so many generations there to witness, one, and two, that it doesn't, those experiences don't go away. It's not like your neighbor moves. Those are somehow connected through familial and community relations that you will always know. Mm-hmm. You will always know. And so those types of ways and how we approach safety and justice in rural communities, I think that's a poignant point, particularly because so many Indigenous people are in small communities. And so it affects our communities so differently. Yeah. I really appreciate that question. How are we doing, Nadine? Voice of reason.
Yeah, I think that might be all the time we have for questions.
It?
So I'll toss it back to you.
Brenda knew we were going to get carried away. Two Northerners and a cup of tea, and an hour later, here we are. I want to thank you, Brenda, for joining and being so candid with your thoughts and your experience and what you've learned through your very long career of pursuing peacemaking for our communities. It's been a real wonderful opportunity to dig in some of these meatier policy and legislative topics. And I know we just scratched the surface. So I appreciate your time so much. It's been a really provocative conversation, and it's been really meaningful for me. It's given me a lot of food for thought. I want to thank the school and to acknowledge that we will be having some other guests. This is number 2 in our session of 5. So our next session will be on November 30th with Tanya Talaga, a former Massey lecturer and journalist and author. We will also have Dr. Marielle Terpel-Lafon coming on December 2nd, and we'll be talking about law. And then we will be wrapping up, focusing on next steps with Cheryl Lightfoot and Andrea Reimer, who are both affiliated with the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs. So I'm really excited for the next 3. I'm not even halfway. So be sure to sign up for those. And appreciate everybody's time tonight. And Brenda, Hamia, Tuyuk noon, thank you so much. Really appreciate your time tonight and for having the ability to work with you in solidarity as we navigate through our public service careers at this moment in time, and for your honesty and forthrightness tonight. Really appreciate that. Hamia, thank you, and thanks to everybody for joining us tonight. We'll see you next time. Bye.